Imagine yourself as a motorcycle manufacturer in the 70s and you have to build a bike to compete with Honda's wildly successful CB750, but you didn't just want to make any old motorcycle, you wanted to make one that is the most complicated humanly possible. What would you get? Something that looks an awful lot like this thing. The 1970s were something of a pivotal era for motorcycling, and it all comes down to one bike, the Honda CB750. This is basically the 1970s era motorcycle. It's the original super sport and a bike that did so well it forced Harley-Davidson to run to President Reagan to drop a tariff on all Japanese motorcycles in 1983 to protect them from competition, because that's how tariffs work. They increase the price we pay for imported goods, making US products seem more competitive by comparison, since a company will always pass on the increased cost onto consumers. What, did you think that some CEO was gonna make less money so that you could get the same product at the same price when it costs them more to ship it to you?
Think, Mark!
So if this motorcycle was so impactful that it literally changed the domestic economic policy of the biggest consumer market on the planet, how could anybody compete? The answer? Two strokes.
Hey, my name is Elijah Reese. I'm one of the owners here at Limey Bikes Vintage Motorcycle Shop in Austin, Texas. The cool part about two strokes is the cylinder gets a power stroke every single time the crank rotates. So basically, you have twice as many explosions, in a rev range with a two-stroke versus a four-stroke, which hypothetically makes them about twice as fast. They're not, especially with modern four-strokes having come as far as they have. Pound for pound, four-strokes put out a lot more juice now, but in the 70s, it was one of the cheapest ways to just add a bunch of extra juice to a bike, was basically make it fire twice as much.
So if a four-stroke is heavier, it makes sense that when Kawasaki and Suzuki tried to make their superbikes, they went with two strokes. Kawasaki went with their air-cooled H2 Mach 4, which ran from 1972 to 1975, and in that short run, it racked up a body count larger than John Wick's.
Allegedly.
The Mach 4 had a 748cc two-stroke triple-cylinder engine putting down 74 horsepower,
Allegedly.
and 57 foot-pounds of torque,
Allegedly.
with a top speed of 120 miles per hour.
Allegedly.
And Kawasaki, in their infinite wisdom, paired that with a single disc, single pot caliper up front and a drum in the back, and that famously squishy 1970s era suspension. No wonder it was a death trap. I'm just kidding. Kinda. But Suzuki wasn't going to be left behind. They also wanted to compete in the superbike game, and so they put their nose to the grindstone and came out with Japan's first liquid-cooled motorcycle, which gave them an edge up on the competition in their silly old air-cooled motorcycles from yesteryear. The GT750 released in 1971 with a 739cc two-stroke triple-cylinder engine, which was functionally the T500 motor with an extra cylinder crudely taped onto the side to up the displacement. The bike put down 70 horsepower and 62 foot-pounds of torque while weighing in at 507 pounds dry, so let's add a few more and call it 530 wet and ready to roll. Speaking of water, this bike was nicknamed the Water Buffalo in the States, the Kettle by the tea-sippin' Brits, and the Water Bottle by the unimaginative Australians, all referring to the massive radiator up front which holds upwards of a gallon of coolant. Its claimed top speed was 110 miles per hour, so in almost every respect, the bike was slower than the H2, but the GT750 did have twin-disc brakes up front, which given the weight, I'd rather have the two pots rather than the one. There were several different models, starting with the J in 1972, which had Suzuki's Suzuki Recycle Injection System, or SRIS, which helped reduce some of the exhaust smoke. But given what I saw when I watched this thing on startup, it looked like a rolling Exxon Valdez spill, so I can't imagine what it looked like without it. By the next model year, Suzuki seemed to have abandoned their attempt to keep this bike competitive in the superbike space and targeted it more at the touring crowd, since it was a big, comfy sofa of a bike that handled pretty well with a broad power band for a two-stroke. They added chrome, naturally, a gear position indicator, and a 3 horsepower bump in 1975. For the last two model years, it received an aesthetic overhaul with black plastic housings for the headlight and around the gauges with a new paint job, but in 1977, the GT750 met the same end that so many bikes seem to meet these days, brought down by that fifth horse of the apocalypse, emissions regulations. That and increased competition from four-strokes, which went through meteoric improvements in such a short period of time. But the GT750 is still a legend to this day. With somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 units made, you can still find some out there. Now, you may have noticed that the footage in this video looks a little bit shaky, and I apologize for that. The camera that I normally use, my Lumix GH6, has had its power image stabilization motor go out, which I'm not going to dive into what that means, but essentially it means that the footage is not as smooth as I normally like it. Now, I have since fixed that issue with the fine folks over on Patreon. You've got their names going by right here. It is because of these folks that I was able to go out and buy myself a brand new Lumix GH6 as a backup so that I can keep doing what I do with no impact to you guys. If you like what you see here and you want to support the channel, click the link down in the description below and check out the Patreon. That's where you'll get access to the Discord server, you'll get access to early videos, and you'll get access to behind the scenes exclusive videos that don't make it to YouTube. However, if you are not feeling like it, don't click that link down below. Just watching the videos is enough for me, and let's hand it off to Elijah and see what makes this bike so freaking weird.
This is kind of an oddball in history. This is the first liquid-cooled two-stroke the Japanese ever made. It was made with Suzuki. You know, they advertise like horsepower. It's a two-stroke, so you expect it to be revvy and fun and exciting, and it's kind of not that. It's kind of a tank. They're kind of heavy. They're kind of slow. The power band is a little short. This has got aftermarket pipes and aftermarket racing carbs on it, so it's got a little bit more oomph than the factory bike, and it still is less exciting than an RD400, even though it's twice as big. So yeah, this thing kind of follows in the tradition of the Cobra, which was the same thing that they did in the 60s, where basically Suzuki's like, hey, we're gonna make a cruiser out of a two-stroke, but we're gonna make it heavy and expensive. So that kind of pulls away a lot of the reasons people buy two-strokes. So weird things. It is a three-cylinder machine, kind of unusual, creates interesting issues with timing in the crank, which means, sorry Yamaha, technically this is a transplane crank, so someone else did it first. But things that make this one kind of bizarre. The giant coolant system. So bike this size, you would expect a coolant system to hold, you know, maybe a half a gallon of liquid. This one is creeping up on a gallon. It's just massive. The head's overdone. There's like 8 bolts per cylinder on a head, which really doesn't have to hold that much pressure. They added an electric start. Pretty much no two-strokes ever, with very few exceptions, got electric start, because they're pretty easy to kick. And Suzuki's like, no, we want this one to be luxury. And they're kind of a pain in the butt to work on. So a couple weird features about these are the crank bearings are shielded. So pretty much every two-stroke ever, you can mix your gas with your oil, shake it up, everything will work great, nothing's gonna explode. Suzuki made that impossible. They put shields around the bearings, which are supposed to make them more efficient, but really it means that if your oil pump ever breaks, your engine goes boom, which is exactly what happened to this one. I had to do a full crank swap. The oiling system is really complicated. There's 9 different oiling lines and pathways that all have to be cleaned and primed, and the oil pumps themselves are kind of overly complicated and don't work as well as one would expect, given that there's no way to bypass it. You'll notice this with a lot of motorcycles. A ton of motorcycles have rear drum brakes to this day. Some bikes have drums all around the Navi. Honda, very new motorcycle, only produced since 2016. Tiny little bike, drums front and rear. Drums are cheap. They last a really long time. They really only have problems if you're a super aggressive rider, and then they suffer brake fade a lot more than disc brakes. So this one is, all the controls are gonna feel normal. It's the last bike we had on here was an Aero Square 4, a whole bunch of stuff was weird. This is gonna feel like a standard motorcycle. You know, the clutch is in the right place, the brakes on the right side, the controls are gonna, the gear shift is 1 down, 4 up. It's what you think. Things are where that you expect them to be. Whereas on the front, you need a lot more braking. Disc became much more popular, and even with the aerials, even by the 60s, disc brakes were becoming popular. Aerial was just a throwback, you know, to an earlier era, and that's why they kind of stuck with the drums, because they're English and that's sort of what they do. For people that love GTs, they're worth it. They're worth money. They're actually fairly expensive motorcycles. The problems are they're incredibly rare. Not incredibly, but the parts are very hard to find. So this one had a blown crankshaft. It took us basically 9 months to source a crank and then find someone who could rebuild the crank and press the bearings, the seals in, that we couldn't do because we didn't have the machine equipment for it. You know, if you did this gas tank, that's it. There isn't another blue GT750 gas tank on eBay for $200. everything's expensive. A lot of these GTs in particular, for some reason, have a plastic drive gear that runs the oiling system. Don't know why. Everything else is metal. They're all either aluminum or steel, and those break all the time. So we had one GT250 in here that went through 4 of these stupid gears in like 3 years, because I rode it all the time. Anyway, they're $300 a piece. They're hard to find. The last one took months of looking till we found, one in someone's basement in Idaho or something. If you want one, they're really interesting. I don't want one. Part of the reason I don't want one, because they're kind of weird and they're kind of big, and they're interesting, but it's not quirky enough like the aerials, where like there's something about an aerial which is so friggin' weird that you kind of want one even though it's a bad idea. This doesn't quite have enough of that like curb appeal. I think we're up to about our 8,000th motorcycle at this point, most of them antiques. This is the 4th GT750 I've ever worked on. More common than the aerials, when you consider that we've worked on more CBXs, and there was only the biggest production year of CBXs ever. They made 40,000, and that bike only had a 4-year production run, and the last year was like 5. They're pretty rare. Are they worth anything? Yes. It's kind of all over the place. There was a period where no one wanted to deal with these things because hard to find parts for. When they have a problem, it's a nightmare. Where are you going to find a 3-cylinder 2-stroke exhaust pipe? Like, that's just shit that doesn't exist. There was a while where you could pick up an okay one for like $3,000 to $5,000. Now they're getting closer to the 10 plus range. This is probably somewhere in the 10 to 15 range, depending on day of the week, direction of the wind, and what usually older guy who remembers having one in college is willing to bid on it. It seems to be the most predominant is nostalgia. Is people who've retired, their kids are gone, and now they've got more money than time left, and they're like, I had one of those when I was 23, and you're like, well, you're like 84, so I wouldn't ride it, but I can see why you'd want one. They're not cheap anymore, and they're not cheap as a hobby machine because you can't get anything, and all the knowledge to work on them is extremely specialized. So like we specialize in vintage bikes. We do a lot of two-strokes. I'm the only person alive I know who's swapped a crank on one of these. Like, that's it. There aren't that many. This doesn't happen very often, but they're cool. They're fun. I'm glad someone else has one and we get to play with it.
And now the fine folks here at Limey Bikes have let me take this thing up and down the block just to see what it's all about. And this is my first time riding this kind of two-stroke. Usually I've just been on little baby singles, so gonna be interesting. Oh man, is this wide. Holy shit. Okay, crazy wide seat there. Let's see, pull it in. Can't tell if it's on. That's first gear. All right. Is that on? I don't see any of the lights on.
That should be on.
Okay. Back in a jiff. Oh man, this thing feels gigantic. It's comical. I gotta be very gentle going through these corners because this is 1960s tires technology is what they said. So wow, this is really cool. And it's a two-stroke, so you don't get any engine braking. Oh man, that's so neat. All right, pull in here. And honestly, it doesn't handle that funny. It handles really normally. It's a beaut, and it's actually my size. Maybe there'll be a GT750 in my life at some point. Yeah, you can really feel when the power comes on. It's a little bit broad, but not very. I'm gonna go down, chuck a Yui, pull into the shop. Wow, is this unique. This is one of the most unique motorcycles I've ever ridden. And honestly, the brakes are not bad. The brakes feel fine. Just a little wooden, but not by much. What an interesting experience. This is so cool. If you guys get a chance, you have to take one of these for a spin. What a way to end, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.